The committee will come to order. I will recognize myself for purposes of an opening statement. Today we meet to fulfill our obligation to share with the Budget Committee our views of the fiscal year 2019 budget. And those views must begin with the state of our economy. After 8 years of Obamonomics and the promise of a recovery summer, we found ourselves stuck in a pothole economy averaging only 1.6% economic growth. Some decide to dub that secular stagnation, but what it really was bad tax policy and bad regulatory policy. With the advent of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, however, all that has changed. Unemployment is now at a 17-year low. Wage growth is at the fastest pace in a decade. More than $5 trillion in new wealth has been created. So the historic Tax Cut and Jobs Act is working to benefit individuals, families, and job creators. The President's Council of Economic Advisors also announced that if the tax cuts were made permanent, we would put another $4 to $7 trillion back into the economy. History has shown us that well-designed tax relief, pro-growth tax relief plans more than pay for themselves. You can go all the way back to the Coolidge tax relief of the 20s. GDP grew at an average annual rate of 4.7%, and the unemployment rate was cut in half. And after these tax relief was enacted, the U.S. actually had a budget surplus. You can look to the tax relief of the Kennedy era, where marginal individual income tax rates were reduced. GDP rose by 8%, and within 5 years had risen to 48%. Once the Reagan tax relief was fully implemented, real growth averaged 4.6% for the remainder of his presidency, and this led to a quarter of a century of strong economic growth, averaging 3.4%, even combating several different recessions. We know that if the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, for it to pay for itself, we need only grow at 2.85%, and after back-to-back quarters of 3% economic growth with the right mix of regulatory policy, I think we are capable of achieving that benchmark and absolutely surpassing it. But there are still clouds on the horizon, not the least of which is the national debt clock, which still rolls out of control in front of me and to my left and my right on the monitor. We now see that the national debt is almost $21 trillion, which is more than $63,000 for every American citizen. It is totally unsustainable. So there is a spending-driven debt crisis in America, and I believe it still is the greatest existential threat in our country that receives little to no attention in Washington. If we do not wake up, we will find ourselves as a second-rate economic power, a second-rate military power, and a second-rate moral authority. So it is important that all the various government agencies and programs within our jurisdiction receive very, very careful scrutiny to make sure that they are meeting the taxpayer test, that the benefits of the program can actually be stated, that we measure programs not by their stated purpose, but by their actual achievements. And we balance that with the cost to our hard-working taxpayers. And so with that, we look forward to presenting our budget views and estimates to the Budget Committee, and certainly the minority side of the aisle has the absolute opportunity to file their minority views and estimates, and I have no doubt that the Budget Committee will read each report very carefully with rapt attention, as they always do. With that, I yield back the balance of my time, and I recognize the ranking member for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, committee Democrats are committed to advancing policies that create shared prosperity and economic opportunities for all, ensure fairness in our economy, protect consumers from predatory practices, and support vulnerable families. By contrast, this president has once again put forth a budget request to Congress that would be deeply harmful to American families and communities throughout our nation. This budget would hurt millions of hardworking families, seniors, veterans, and persons with disabilities. It cuts deeply into the social safety net, eliminating billions of dollars in funding for health care, supplemental nutrition assistance, and housing programs. Trump's budget proposal cuts the Department of Housing and Urban Development's budget by 24.1%. Compared to current levels, eliminates new funding for the National Housing Trust Fund and Capital Magnet Fund, and eliminates the Community Development Financial Institutions Fund and the Community Development Block Grant and Home Investment Partnership Programs. The Trump proposal also completely cuts funding to repair and maintain public housing. This amounts to the total abandonment of the effort to provide safe, decent, and affordable housing for millions of children, families, seniors, and veterans across the country. These cuts are simply senseless and cruel. Mr. Chairman, let me just say that I'm also looking to work with you on the homelessness crisis. And there are over 550,000 people experiencing homelessness in this country. Over 20% of the homeless population are children, and over 7% are veterans. This pressing problem requires the attention of this committee. We have talked about this before, so I'm looking forward to having some closure on the possibility of having a hearing. The Trump budget also continues the misguided and reckless Republican effort to dismantle the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act and gut the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. It calls for the elimination of the Consumer Bureau's independent funding and would reduce its ability to crack down on predatory financial institutions. In their continuing efforts to remove the critical protections Democrats put in place following the financial crisis, Republicans are leaving hard-working Americans behind in order to do the bidding of Wall Street. They appear to be determined to take us back to the flawed system that led to the financial crisis. Congressional Republicans are working in lockstep with this president, all the while looking the other way and enabling his shameful actions and behavior. The majority's views and estimates on the budget align with Trump's agenda and would take the country backwards, leaving millions of Americans worse off. Democrats will continue to stand up to the regressive policies of the majority and Donald Trump and stand up for hardworking Americans. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Pursuant to notice, I call up the views and estimates of the Committee on Financial Services on the fiscal year 2019 budget resolution. The clerk will report the measure which was distributed in advance.
Views and estimates of the Committee on Financial Services on matters to be set.
Without objection, the views and estimates are considered read and open to amendment at any point. Who seeks recognition? Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentlelady from New York seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk, Mr. Chairman.
We'll pause and allow the amendment to be distributed.
Section 8.
I'm sorry, does the gentlelady have more than one amendment?
Yes.
And which one is this styled?
Velasquez number 1 is.
Okay, Velasquez number 1. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Ms. Velasquez, page 9, line 24.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentlelady is recognized on her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, my amendment is simple and straightforward. It ensures that as part of this committee's oversight of the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program, we will examine the conduct of Section 8 landlords to ensure that they are following the rules and regulations set forth by HUD and participating in the program in a fair and ethical manner. The nation is currently experiencing an affordable housing crisis, Mr. Chairman. The home ownership rate has declined to 64.2%, an almost 30-year low, while rental demand has increased, pushing vacancy rates to almost 7%. Today, the average rental asking price is $910, up more than 23% since 2010. This has caused over half of all renters to become cost burden, approximately 20.8 million households. Over 72% of low-income households, those making under $15,000 per year, are severely cost burdened. The Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program assists our nation's most economically vulnerable, and without it, many of the individuals and families assisted by the Section 8 program will be at risk of homelessness. Although families are free to choose any available housing in their community, landlords still discriminate against low-income tenants because they are voucher holders. As a result, the Section 8 program has only a 60% success rate in helping tenants secure affordable housing. Further compounding the affordability crisis is the issue of gentrification. Gentrification is occurring in cities and neighborhoods across our country. In my home city of New York, neighborhoods have undergone rapid revitalization, causing property values to rise dramatically. As a result, there have been serious allegations and, in some cases, prosecution of landlords intentionally allowing their federally subsidized units to deteriorate in an effort to drive voucher users out and convert units to higher market rate apartments. Therefore, it is necessary for this committee to investigate discrimination against sources of income, discourage intentional acts by landlords to disqualify dwellings units from federal housing programs, and encourage proper maintenance of multifamily housing in order to revive the Section 8 program, affirmatively further fair housing policies, and address our national affordability crisis. Mr. Chairman, I urge members to support this important amendment.
Would the gentlelady yield?
Yes, sure.
I appreciate the gentlelady, number one, filing her amendments in a timely fashion so that the majority had an opportunity to review. I would point out again, the minority has the ability to file their own views, but we have carefully reviewed the gentlelady's amendment. We think it is an improvement to the budget views and estimates, and I am prepared to accept the amendment, and I thank the lady for her leadership on Section 8, and I yield back to the gentlelady.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
And the gentlelady yields back. Who seeks recognition? Is there any further debate on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman,
if not, the question.
Mr. Chairman, a second amendment. Oh, no, I'm sorry.
You probably want to vote on your first amendment
Yes.
before we go to the second one. The question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Velasquez. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. For what purpose does the gentlelady from New York seek recognition again?
I have an amendment of this, Mr.
Styled Velasquez number 2?
Yes, correct.
We will pause and allow the amendment to be distributed.
I offered this last year, right?
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Ms. Velasquez, page 10, line 1, after the...
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentlelady is recognized on her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment seeks to address a rapidly growing health crisis facing our fellow Americans living in public housing. 1.2 million households live in public housing units across the country, many of which are aging and deteriorating. Chronic underfunding is a threat to this housing stock, which has significant need. Since 2010, funding for public housing capital projects has decreased by 24%, from $2.5 billion annually to $1.9 billion annually in 2017. And it is estimated that the New York City Housing Authority, in my home city of New York, has a $19 billion backlog of much-needed repairs. This investment has consequences. Nationwide, 200,000 units of public housing has been lost since 2010, and 10,000 are at risk of being lost each year unless critical funding gaps are filled. Public housing units continue deteriorating because we don't provide sufficient funding to make necessary repairs in these buildings, making the affordable housing crisis all the more painful. Unfortunately, President Trump's budget request for HUD for fiscal year 2019 continues to threaten the very future of public housing in this country. Budget documents revealed by the administration last month indicate President Trump and Secretary Carson are considering completely eliminating funding for HUD's Public Housing Capital Fund, which is the main source of financing public housing authorities rely on to address important repair needs like roofs, heaters, and piping. Public housing residents face severe health consequences as a result of living in these buildings, Mr. Chairman, and the administration's desire to zero out the capital fund will only exacerbate our capital needs backlog and intensify the public health crisis facing residents. Health problems such as asthma, respiratory illness, and elevated lead levels are major concerns for public housing residents throughout the nation. In New York City, one study found that asthma prevalence amongst children living in NYCHA housing is nearly 2 times higher than rates among children living in other types of housing in the city. But this is a fixable public health crisis, Mr. Chairman. Aging infrastructure is in many cases the root cause of health issues. The fix is not complicated. We need to replace roofs and fix leaky exteriors. Targeted capital funding will have concrete, measurable impacts for residents for public housing. The most pressing public health and capital repairs to address them will vary in agencies across the country. Some PHS must fix roofs to eliminate recurring mold causing asthma and respiratory illness. Others need to remediate lead-based paint to prevent elevated blood lead levels, and still others need to address other building infrastructure issues to continue to provide safe, decent public housing to residents. My amendment will ensure this committee investigates the funding needs of our public housing agencies when conducting oversight. We owe to public housing residents to explore ways to improve the health and well-being of them and their families. With that, Mr. Chairman.
Would you yield to the chairman?
Sure.
At the risk of repeating myself, I intend to repeat myself. Again, the gentlelady from New York chose to file her amendments on a timely basis. She chose to work with the majority. I am prepared to accept her amendment to the budget views and estimates. I would note that under the leadership of Chairman Duffy, our Housing and Insurance Subcommittee has already begun a review process of capital repairs and capital spending, starting out with a field hearing at a Native American reservation. I know that the chairman intends on committing the same review to public housing, and so I encourage you to continue to work with Chairman Duffy on this, but it's an important issue. I appreciate your leadership, and again, for those who file their amendments on a timely basis and work with the majority, we try to work with you and include these where we can, and we're certainly going to do that with the gentlelady from New York, and I recommend acceptance of the amendment. I yield back to the gentlelady from New York.
Would the gentlelady yield for the
Yes.
last 30 seconds? I would also echo what the chairman iterated, that I think it was appropriate that the gentlelady from New York filed the amendment early. We share a concern about what's happening in public housing. I know you have unmet capital needs, I think $17 billion in New York. You have mold issues in your community. As the chairman mentioned, we have mold issues in my community. And again, I think this is language that we had adopted in the last Congress, but I look forward to continuing to work with you in both of our communities, which are very different but share very similar issues. So thank you for the amendment. I would encourage all to vote for it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Time of the gentlelady has expired. Is there any further debate on the amendment? If not, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Velasquez. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the ranking member seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
We will pause and allow the amendment to be distributed. Does the ranking member only have one amendment, or is it styled in a certain fashion?
This is Waters Amendment number 1.
Waters number 1, please. We will pause and allow the amendment to be distributed. clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Ms. Waters on page 10, after line 22, insert the following: homeless assistance. The committee believes that it should
Without
have
objection, the
priority-
reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentlelady is recognized on her amendment.
Very much, Mr. Chairman. My amendment adds language on homelessness to the budget views and estimates. While this committee has not taken up this issue for the past 6 years, there are over 550,000 homeless people in America today, located in both urban and rural communities alike, and they deserve our attention. Mr. Chairman, year after year, the issue of homelessness has not been given the attention this issue deserves in this chamber. It is, yet again, not even mentioned in the budget reviews and estimates for this coming fiscal year. And despite the fact that every Democrat on this committee has asked for hearings from multiple Congresses, we have not had a single hearing convened on the state of homelessness in this country. This committee has also failed to mark up a single bill focused on homelessness. So here we are again, Mr. Chairman, and yet another budget views and estimates that says virtually nothing about the homeless. We have a responsibility to all of our constituents, and that includes the homeless. In fact, half of all people experiencing homelessness in this country are in one of 5 states, Mr. Chairman, including California and Texas. Yet, it is not often understood that the state of Texas alone has 23,548 homeless people. So it is appalling that despite the fact that both the chair and ranking member of the Committee of Jurisdiction over Homeless Assistance Programs represents 2 states with the top numbers of homeless persons, our committee still cannot seem to find the time or the inclination to do something about it. This is unacceptable. So today, Mr. Chairman, I'm asking for consideration and support for real solutions to end homelessness. Like my bill, the Ending Homelessness Act of 2017, which I introduced earlier this Congress, my bill provides a comprehensive solution that would effectively end homelessness in this country so that no person, including veterans, women, or children, will have to face the devastating and long-lasting impacts of being homeless. Mr. Chairman, there's simply no excuse for this committee to continue to ignore those with the greatest housing needs. So I would urge my colleagues to adopt this amendment. I thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purposes, gentleman from Wisconsin seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Just, Mr. Chairman, I would note that when we are talking about important issues like this, I think the model as set by the gentlelady from New York to say, hey, let's file our amendments, let's discuss them, let's try to come to bipartisan agreement, because I think there is a lot of agreement on many issues, especially in the housing space. But this amendment, I believe, was just provided to us right now, which makes it hard to go through the amendment and analyze. I think it's also important, Mr. Chairman, to not just look and say, we're effective when we spend more money. And sometimes that is the answer. Sometimes we just need more money to help resolve whether it was the mold issue that the gentlelady from New York was talking about in our communities, or whether it's homelessness across America. But sometimes we have to look at, are the programs that we have in place, are they effective? Are we effectively using the money that we put into the programs today? And if we're not, why do we spend more money on maybe programs that aren't utilizing their resources effectively? From my perspective, I come from rural America, and this is one of our complaints. A lot of resources go to urban centers and don't come to rural America. And poverty in rural America is just as catastrophic for families as it is in urban America. And the Secretary of HUD, Dr. Carson, came and did a homelessness and hunger summit with us just about a month and a half ago. And this is always a big issue for my communities, because when you have small communities with limited resources trying to deal with homelessness that oftentimes looks different as well. I mean, we're rural, we're cold. You have people who are couch surfing to staying in cars, and the programs don't adequately address our needs. again, I think it's taking a look at how are we spending money? Are we improving the lives of people who find themselves homeless, or how much money actually are we getting to those who are in need, and how much money goes into the administration of programs, the bureaucracy of programs? How many, what percent of each dollar actually gets to help the lives of people in our community? Not only that, how many people do we help get out of this moment of crisis? How many people do we take from homelessness to sustainability?
Will the gentleman yield?
In one moment I will.
Okay.
So I appreciate the gentlelady's amendment. I'm not inclined to agree to it today, but this is an issue that I would like to work with her on. And I would just note that there is a way to do this in a bipartisan fashion. I think the ranking member does know that we have a willingness to participate together, but you got to file your amendments early so we can work on them.
Would the gentleman yield to the chairman?
I will yield to the chairman.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Again, I would echo, the ranking member always has the opportunity, if she so chooses, to share these amendments with the majority so that we can work with her. She chooses not to. That is her choice, but it also means that it will be challenging to move forward on any of these amendments. With respect to homelessness, is a very serious issue, and I think anybody who spent any time dealing in the issue knows that some of the challenges are not within this committee's jurisdiction. We know there are serious challenges in the mental health arena. We know there are serious challenges in substance abuse. We know there are serious challenges in the breakup of families, and there's also serious challenges with respect to economic opportunity. And with respect to economic opportunity and lifting people out of poverty, what a difference it makes to have an economy grow at 3% as opposed to 1.6%, which has truly alleviated poverty for many. And so, again, it's a serious issue, but if the amendment were to be taken serious, I would think it would have been filed earlier. I think it would be. The chair is speaking at the moment. I think the gentleman indicated he would yield to the chair. I have no doubt the ranking member will get plenty of time on her side of the aisle. Again, I would just point out, if the gentlelady wishes to work with the majority, I would encourage her to do what some members on her side of the aisle has done and file this early. Also, I'm concerned about language that seems to have the reflexive knee-jerk reaction that there must be increased funding for a government program. Well, how does that evaluate the results? Where's the evaluation of economic growth that truly makes a difference? So I would urge rejection of the gentlelady's amendment, and the time of the gentleman from Wisconsin has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I yield to my friend from California.
Thank you so very much. I am so disappointed that the chairman would dare use a flimsy excuse for not including homelessness in this budget review and given consideration to my amendment. This amendment is essentially the same amendment that has been filed before. And so, again, if the chairman is serious about homelessness and about the fact that people are on the streets, in cars, in alleys, as has been described here today, he would not use his influence and his power to ignore that, but rather at least agree that this is a serious problem, not only in California and New York and other places, but also in his own state, in his own district. And to simply say we can't deal with it because the amendment was not filed in a timely fashion is an excuse that's just totally unacceptable. And I tell you, I am agitated about this because every week we're getting reports from various media about the homelessness. And while I identify what is happening in my own home state and in your home state, Mr. Chairman, let me tell you, it's around the country that we have this kind of problems. And with the opioid problem that we have more and more people who are in the alleys and on the streets with these drug addiction problems. And so, If you are serious about homelessness, if you really care about homelessness, you would pass my amendment today, and it would not go any further until we got together and we worked on it to try and satisfy whatever your concerns are about dealing with this serious issue. So I would simply say to you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Duffy, if you're serious about doing something about homelessness, let's have you support this amendment today, and I will work with you to deal with your concerns about cost and other kinds of things that you may be concerned about. But let's not punish the people on the street. Let's not punish the families on the street. Let's not punish the veterans on the street. Let's make sure we use our influence and our power, which is considerable, to deal with this issue. We have talked about it from this side of the aisle time and time again. How dare us leave this committee without at least, if we do nothing else, deal with how we're going to move to get rid of this homelessness in our country. This is a shame. For the most prosperous country in the world, the richest country in the world, that we have increasing homelessness. At one time, it was thought that it was like single men or that it was, vagrants of some kind. This is about children, and this is about families that are on the street. This is about children who sleep in cars and still find their way to school every day. Ashamed, not wanting people to know how they're living, but they find ways to go and clean up wherever they can and find showers, et cetera, et cetera. They go to school and they won't talk about their home life because they're, again, so ashamed that they're living in cars. And we sit here and talk about, Mr. Chairman, you cannot move forward with my amendment because of some technical error that you think I have committed, and I have not. This, again, is a bill that's been before us before, essentially the same bill. So the excuse about it was not filed in a timely manner is embarrassing. It is not acceptable. And I would say to you, give it another thought. Please have a heart. Please think about what's happening not only in your hometown, but in my hometown and across this country. Let's not go out of this committee today without dealing with homelessness. And with that, I'm not going to give up. I'll yield to the gentleman from Colorado.
And I thank the gentlelady. So, I mean, the thing that bothers me the most here is listening to the chairman. It's okay to do $1.5 trillion cut for the wealthiest Americans, the biggest corporations, and the chairman and Mr. Duffy are worried about the cost, which is pretty minimal comparatively, for helping the homeless. I mean, there is something outrageous about that, and it's got to change. And I'd yield back to the chair and give up my time.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Who seeks recognition? There's no further debate on the amendment. The question now occurs on the amendment offered by the ranking member. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. Nay, in the opinion of the chair, the nays appear to have it. For what purpose does the ranking member seek recognition? I seek recognition for a recorded vote. Recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote shall raise their hand and be counted. A sufficient number having raised their hands, a recorded vote is so ordered and pursuant to subsection C5, Rule 3 of the committee rules. Further proceedings on the amendment are postponed. Is there further amendment or discussion? Who seeks recognition? What purpose does the gentleman from Massachusetts seek recognition? Does the gentleman just have one? Amendment number 3 from the gentleman from Massachusetts. We'll pause and allow the amendment to be distributed.
Thank you very much.
All members received a copy of the amendment. If so, the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Lynch, Choice Neighborhoods Initiative. Insert on page
Without objection, the
5.
reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentleman is recognized on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the ranking member. This amendment deals with the Choice Neighborhood Initiative. My amendment would ensure that our committee recognizes the importance of grant programs to revitalize severely distressed public housing and assisted housing, including HUD's Choice Neighborhoods Initiative, also called CNI. As many of you know, I grew up in the Old Colony housing projects, recently renamed the Ann Lynch Homes at Old Colony after my mom. So I have a deep and boundless appreciation for the gift of public housing and what a blessing it can be on families that have nowhere else to go. Unfortunately, this administration, their budget proposes a zero funding level for the Choice Neighborhood Initiative, which is focused on revitalizing severely distressed public and publicly assisted housing. According to the FY19 congressional justifications from the Obama administration, the key outcomes of the Choice Neighborhood program includes transforming distressed public and or assisted housing units into physically and financially viable housing for the long term, supporting positive health, safety, employment, mobility, and educational outcomes for residents in the target developments and surrounding neighborhoods, creates viable mixed-income neighborhoods that have access to well-functioning services and high-quality public schools and education programs, public assets, public transportation, improved access to jobs, and attracting significant financial investments by the public and private sectors to high-poverty neighborhoods. For far too many American families, the gap between incomes and the cost of housing in the private market is much too large. For example, it's impossible, virtually impossible, for a full-time minimum wage worker to afford a modest two-bedroom rental home at market rates almost anywhere in America. As a result, public housing is a critical public asset that is a key part of our nation's social safety net, providing safe, decent, and affordable housing for about 1.1 million families in public housing and an additional 4.7 million people who receive some level of federal Section 8 assistance. Unfortunately, our nation's public housing is plagued by a chronic underinvestment. This is only getting worse under the Trump administration and the Republican-controlled Congress. I think the days of ignoring this problem are over. Our committee must take a comprehensive approach to funding public housing development and revitalizing neighborhoods. And based upon the majority's views and estimates, it's rather counterintuitive, but the majority is suggesting that tenant-based rental assistance voucher programs should be enhanced to encourage recipients of housing assistance to move to areas with greater opportunities. Well, that's what this does. That's what CNI does. It already provides mobility assistance, education. Many of the barriers to these families are educational barriers, transportation barriers, and those are the very barriers that the CNI program seeks to overcome. Picking up hundreds of thousands of families and having them move out of their neighborhoods, out of their communities where they've lived their whole lives to other areas is problematic on a couple of instances. One, it destroys that neighborhood. Secondly, the reason they're in those neighborhoods is because they're low rent. And oftentimes, the areas with higher opportunity are higher rent areas. They can't afford where they're living now in many cases, and you want them to move to a more expensive area of the city or area of the country. So my amendment would ensure our committee invests in the Choice Neighborhood Initiative and other grant programs to revitalize severely distressed public and assisted housing so distressed public and assisted housing can be restored. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back the balance of our time. Thank you.
For our purposes, the gentleman from Wisconsin seek recognition.
Move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And to address Mr. Lynch's, maybe not the amendment specifically, but how this is actually operating as well as the ranking member. Maybe this is a dirty little secret that we have in Congress, but if we want to get anything done, we know that we have to work together. Because I know we can pass anything out of the House, but as a Republican, but if I want to get a bill passed in the Senate, I need you all to participate with me. That's why I'll have conversations with all of you. We all talk to each other on priorities that we want to accomplish. And so in the broader view of the public, they see us fight like cats and dogs, but we know behind the scenes we work together. We talk to each other, and we don't always agree, but we know if we're going to be successful on this committee, we talk and we work together. And my concern is that my friends across the aisle, you know that too, and when we bring up amendments where we don't share them in advance so we can work through them and talk about them and find agreement on them like the gentlelady from New York did. This is an important initiative. She cares about her community, and she says, hey, I'm going to show you my amendment. I want you to buy into it. If you have any recommendations for change, you can
Gentleman, yield for just one moment.
I will in a second.
Okay, thank you.
That's my concern on what's happening today. If we really care about these issues, let's bring the amendments forward in advance. We know that we tweak and modify. Maybe for a moment, maybe the gentleman did that. I haven't seen this amendment yet.
I want to, if given the opportunity, I would like to agree with the gentleman, but I would add, with all due respect, that no one came to me when they said they were going to zero out the program. That would have helped. So I get handed a views and estimates that they're zeroing out one of the programs that I think helps families that are struggling in my district most of all. No one came to me and said, hey, we got this idea about zeroing out the budget for that program that cuts funding for your family so that now they'll be homeless. No, I agree, we got to have dialogue. We got to talk to each other. But you and President Trump zeroed out this program. And this is the first opportunity that I've had to have that meaningful discussion with my friend and colleague.
I'm going to reclaim my time, and I think the gentleman understands that you didn't just receive that information this morning before you came into the hearing. You've had that for days. You said, oh, it's been zeroed out. I wasn't talked about it. I don't like it. Again, there's a lot of things that both President Obama and Trump have done in their budgets that we don't like, that we actually, we laugh off their budgets. We do our own budgets in the Congress, and we work our own will. And that's why in the days before this hearing, this amendment could have been brought up to say, hey, you guys, this is an important program. Let's work together to make sure there's adequate funding for it. And that's just my concern that goes to the ranking member and to this amendment specifically. But I think the goals, I don't disagree with the goals of the amendment. I am objecting to the style in which these are being brought up. And I would just note that we need a strategic, comprehensive plan that's coming from HUD. We didn't have one under the Obama era, and we don't have one right now. And I would encourage our current secretary to work with all the employees of HUD to have a crystal clear, strategic, comprehensive plan that can address all of these issues. But again, on its merits, I don't necessarily disagree with the goals. But I think, again, we need HUD to be better about having a holistic picture of what's going on. And sometimes I think doing rifle shots here are not always the best approach. And I just, to my colleague, you've known that you're going to have the amendment for days, and I think these issues, when we work together, and we all know this, we all know, to the ranking member, I talk to her all the time. She gets sick of it sometimes when I talk to her. She'll wave me off on occasion, but we do this together. And this is an opportunity where these issues could be resolved as a congressional family, as opposed for what I would argue is somewhat partisan when they're just sprung on us at the last moment.
Would the gentleman yield to the chairman?
I would.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Again, to the best of my knowledge, the minority had our budget views and estimates on Thursday. Today is Tuesday. My guess is there would be great protest and wailing and gnashing of teeth if we presented our budget views and estimates when we gavelled in at 10 o'clock and you didn't have an opportunity to see them. So on these amendments that we're seeing for the first time, I have no doubt they are offered in good faith, but they appear to be messaging amendments. You're welcome to them. I encourage you to file them in your minority views and estimates, and I have no doubt the Budget Committee will give both of our reports the attention they deserve. Gentleman from Wisconsin's time has expired who seeks recognition. For what purpose does the ranking member seek recognition? Gentlelady's recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I'm very pleased to see that Mr. Lynch has brought this important issue to our attention. It is simply shameful that this administration is continuing its attack on the public housing program in this latest budget request, which includes a complete elimination of the Choice Neighborhoods Initiative, the only grant program at HUD designed to revitalize severely distressed public and assisted housing. I include authorization for the CNI in my comprehensive public housing bill that I introduced earlier this Congress, and for whom Mr. Lynch is a co-sponsor. While the program has room for improvement, particularly regarding tenant protections, we know that HUD has made some measurable progress toward addressing many of the deficiencies that we identified in its successor program. HUD data has identified over 100,000 units in this country that are severely distressed and in need of critical repairs. Many of these properties have suffered decades of neglect in the face of chronic underfunding from the federal government. Now is not the time to be rolling back programs aimed at preserving what little affordable housing we currently have. And let me just say that, you know, as I look at this particular amendment by Mr. Lynch, I hear the same kind of excuses that I heard a few minutes ago about non-support of my amendment dealing with homelessness. Mr. Duffy talks about what HUD needs to do in developing a strategic, comprehensive plan. I didn't hear him say that when Mr. Carson was before the committee. I didn't hear him challenge the HUD secretary in any shape, form, or fashion. I didn't hear him raise any questions. He was busy talking about how wonderful he is. And so now that he's talking, I want to know if you care so much about, if you, meaning any of the members on the opposite side of the aisle, care so much about any of this, why don't you initiate something? Why is it the Democratic side of the aisle has to constantly initiate programs for the least of these, for homelessness? I don't think Mr. Duffy's ever had a program dealing with, on a bill, or an initiative, or anything showing what he cares about, he claims he cares about. And I have not heard him or the chairman of this committee talk about caring about public housing and the fact that these units are in great disrepair, et cetera, of the choice program. So if you care so much about these and you're only hampered because we didn't submit our amendments in a timely fashion, then I'm not so sure that that's really being concerned, because we would find a way to deal with the amendments that have been presented.
Would the gentlelady yield?
No, I will not.
Okay.
In a timely fashion. I want to just say that, again, I'm going to get back to homelessness. We have found that 20% of the homeless population, or 114,829 people, are children experiencing homelessness, and over 7% are veterans. Now, we hear a lot from the opposite side of the aisle about how they care about veterans and how we must do for veterans. Well, I want you to know, if you want to help veterans, then you ought to be dealing with these issues that we're bringing before you. If you're not going to bring them, you have the majority. You have the power to pass out anything that you want in this committee. You have not initiated anything on homelessness. You have not initiated anything on protection of public housing. You are supporting the president's elimination of the Choice Neighborhoods initiatives. So, you know, I'm a little bit sick and tired of hearing Mr. Duffy talk out of both sides of his mouth about what he cares about, and at the same time opposing whatever we initiate for the least of these. And so I'm going to challenge him again, and of course the chairman, to deal with this issue of homelessness. I suppose we'll be... No, I will not. I will not yield anything to you today, Mr. Duffy. I am a little bit disturbed about how you're handling this issue and the excuses that you're making about why we cannot deal with my amendment or Mr. Lynch's amendment. And also to let you know, we have filed our amendments in a timely fashion.
The chair would remind all members of their requirement under the rules of the House to observe the principles of decorum and courtesy in debate set forth in Rule 17 and by related provisions in Jefferson's manual, including by speaking and acting respectfully and by refraining from the use of disorderly words or unparliamentary language. I strongly admonish all members to adhere to these requirements so we can proceed with civil discussion and information gathering. Is there any further debate on the amendment? If not, the question now occurs on the, for what purpose does the gentleman from Massachusetts seek recognition?
Strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I was going to come here with 100 amendments because there's so much in this budget that I disagree with. It's ridiculous. And I, be honest with you, I made a decision basically along Mr. Duffy's lines that we all know this budget's not going anyplace. And, you know, we know that. And I just decided, you know what? This budget is so bad on so many levels that it's not worth the time for me to sit here and make point after point. My constituents know where I stand. America knows where we stand. And to be perfectly honest, the procedural stuff, it's important. I know when we were in the majority, some of us made that. I've never made that argument. The procedure is the procedure. You bring amendments when you bring amendments, and that's it. And you argue about the substance of the issue. But the truth is exactly what the ranking member just said. Every single program in housing is advocated for by our side of the aisle. And I don't hear your side advocating for anything. You cut out CDBG. You zeroed that out, too. That goes to your cities and towns to hire police to fix things in their communities, not just Democratic ones, yet you zeroed that out. Homeless veterans? Homeless veterans? Shame. Shame in America for having homeless veterans. Homeless children? Shame. And again, not only there's no attempt that we could debate substance, there's no discussion of it. And when we try to do it, we get told, oh, well, you know, we didn't know. Sure you did. You know there are homeless veterans. You don't like our proposals? Come up with something. And for me, that's why these exercises, 24% cut in the discretionary budget at HUD, while they're making $30,000 tables and china sets? Come on. Come on. And that's why I looked at this and I said, you know what? I have to come by to at least express my frustration with a process that is a kabuki dance for America. Nothing substantive will come out of this today, except we'll make some points, and the points are almost all going to be, your side doesn't seem to care about this. It's an important point. It's one I don't like making, to be perfectly honest, because I agree, we have to work together. And when we take the majority, we're going to have to work with you. And I hope that we do. So rather than going through this nonsense, honestly, this kind of stuff just frustrates the heck out of me, and it will render me more likely to engage in the kind of debate that the chairman just admonished, which I probably think is not a healthy thing to do. I agree with him. I'm just going to leave it at that and just say, look, you know, welcome to your budget. Welcome to your defense of Trump's attack on American housing across the board. That's what this is. And I know you know it. I know you do. I don't think that's what's in your heart, because if it were, you would have proposed it. You would have said zero these things out. But instead, you're left to defend the president's proposal, which is ludicrous, honestly not worth the debate on many levels, and we're then reduced to procedural arguments that I didn't see the amendment. Well, again, fine, I accept that, but it would have been a lot better if someone on the other side had had an amendment to do something about veterans' homelessness, children's homelessness, CDBG, the choice program, and on and on and on. And, Mr. Chairman, that to me is really what America wants to hear and what America wants to see, and that's why I can only do this so much before I start getting upset, and I won't do that, and I'll yield back the remainder of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any further debate on the amendment? If not, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Massachusetts. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. Nay. In the opinion of the chair, the nays have it. The amendment is not adopted. For what purpose does the gentleman from Massachusetts seek recognition? Recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of recorded vote shall raise their hand and be counted. Sufficient number having raised their hands, the recorded vote is so ordered, and pursuant to subsection C5 of Rule 3, the committee rules for the proceedings on the amendment are postponed. Is there further amendment or discussion? Who seeks recognition? What purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
We'll pause and allow the amendment to be distributed. Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Kildee, page 10, line 23.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the interest of efficiency, let's just sort of stipulate that we disagree on the timeliness of the submission of these amendments. This is a simple amendment. It's one that I think, upon immediately reading it, is completely understandable to any member of Congress. And so while 48 or 24 or 2.5 hours might have given you a chance to offer this in a bipartisan fashion, I simply ask that we just stipulate to the fact that we disagree on the legitimate right of members to submit amendments at committee and how you will consider them. And I ask you to just take this at face value. This is an amendment regarding the Community Development Block Grant Program, a program that has long enjoyed bipartisan support, has a long and successful track record of helping hundreds of communities, cities, and counties meet their locally identified needs. In fact, from 2005 through 2013, CDBG-related funding is estimated to have created or sustained over 330,000 jobs in local economies, helping over 1.1 million people with home ownership, et cetera, providing public services to over 105 million individuals, and provided public improvements that have benefited 33 million people nationwide. But CDBG has experienced consistent funding cuts over the last decade. In FY17, this program was funded at $3 billion. My amendment essentially suggests raising that level back to the approximate level for fiscal year '06, which was again supported in a bipartisan fashion, to bring that up to $4.1 billion. Communities all over the country have benefited from this program's impact. However, in the first two budgets that this White House has submitted, they have proposed zeroing out this really important program. Democrats and Republicans have consistently worked together to ensure that this funding is restored. And in fact, we did this last year in a bipartisan fashion, not to the level that many of us would have liked to have seen, but to a level that at least provides some minimal support to those communities that are really struggling and can look to the federal government to help them fund the priorities that they identify for themselves. It's one of the few federal programs that, again, allows cities and towns, communities, an important source for locally developed priorities. And those locally developed priorities lead to projects that many of us celebrate and across the aisle that we support. And I know just by looking at media reports that we participate in. We go to the ribbon cuttings, Democrats and Republicans. And to be fair, as I said before, Democrats and Republicans have come together to ensure that while the president believes this program should be zeroed out, we think it should be funded. And so while, yes, we have some questions about process, there was a process that led to the development of the budget views and estimates that left out any reference to CDBG at the same time that the president is proposing elimination of a program that we have demonstrated that we both have supported over the years. So when it comes to the way this document reads, we ought to articulate our values. We ought to stand up and say, you know what, this is a program we support. We support the outcomes that it creates. Are there reforms that are needed? Absolutely. But we support the effort of the federal government to provide local governments with the tools they need to meet their locally determined needs. And we ought not be silent on that question. This amendment says this is an important program and suggests that it be funded at the level that President George W. Bush funded it at. I think that's a reasonable, thoughtful improvement to the document. It's one that does not take hours to absorb. And I would simply ask in good faith that my friends on the other side of the aisle consider supporting this amendment because you support the program. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Wisconsin seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I want to reiterate the point that presidents, Democrat and Republican, send their budgets, and oftentimes the Congress, no matter who's in party, we somewhat laugh those budgets off and we do what we think is right. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe that the president's budget last year zeroed out this money as well. And what did we do in this Congress? We actually funded it to the tune of, I think, $3 billion. So let's not start to hyperventilate about—
Would the gentleman yield?
No, not quite yet.
I mean, that was the point that I just made if you'd been listening to the comments.
The time belongs to the gentleman from Wisconsin.
And I'll just note that I've asked to be given time, but I'm not interrupting anybody either as we go through the dialogue. It was funded to the tune of $3 billion. Let's be clear on that. So we impose our will in our budgets. And so I don't want to freak out the American people or those communities that use this money because these are resources that will flow from this Congress. But I also think it's important to note that the money should be used for targeting low-income families and neighborhoods. And oftentimes this money can be used for an array of different issues that don't necessarily target those low-income families and neighborhoods. And I believe there needs to be some radical transformations in the way this program is administered so that money does go to those communities, those families, those neighborhoods that are in most need. But with that said, I want to go back to this point, and I'm all about kicking dead horses, and I'm going to kick this one till it's a bloody pulp. If you want to get something done, we work together. All of us know that. We all work together on issues that we want to get through the Senate. And to spring amendments on us now and to throw your hands up in the air and think that you're trying to work in a bipartisan fashion by putting out an amendment that I see 20 seconds before it's read and think that we're going to have bipartisanship on that, that's just, I mean, you know better than that. And so if you really believe in these programs, if the ranking member really believes in getting modifications for homelessness resources, she would have provided an amendment and said, let's work together. I've done that with her on flood. Now, we didn't come to an agreement, but I'm willing to work with her. I say a lot of great things about her. She can throw her hands up and say how evil I am. I think she's a nice lady. We might disagree on politics, but she's a good person, and we work together on issues. We could work together on these amendments, but when you bring them up the day of the hearing, and we see them right when they're introduced, that doesn't have an air of bipartisanship. That doesn't have an air of us trying to work together and resolve the issues that you say are so important to you. If it's important to you, we work together. If you're using this for partisan political purposes, you introduce them so we see them a moment before they're read off the table. I think that's a wrong approach. And we all know, we work together. It could happen here too. I don't agree with every point in the president's budget, and nor do you. And we're going to work together on our issues to make sure we get right funding amounts. But it comes as a Congress, but not in a partisan fashion where we introduce these and say, here, I'm going to spring it on you and try to make a political point and throw my hands up in the air when you won't agree with my amendment, when I'm going to throw it at you and let you see it right when it's right off the table. So with that, I'm concerned about the process. I will yield to the gentleman.
First of all, let me apologize for interrupting you earlier.
Apology accepted.
But what you were articulating was almost word for word exactly what I said in the comments that I made when I was introducing the amendment. And so I wanted to point that out, that we are in perfect agreement on that point. And I also will stipulate that we disagree on process, because I actually don't want to concede the point that this markup is somehow exempt from the ability to have a colloquy that might lead to agreement. If the majority truly believes that you will never support an amendment that is not pre-filed, since you write the rules for the committee, you could just simply say that no amendment that's not pre-filed would be considered.
I'm going to reclaim my time. Though you can file an amendment the day of, if you want to get it accepted and get a bipartisan buy-in, you provide it to us beforehand. And I think the chairman made a great point. What would you say if the budget views and estimates were given to you this morning at 10 o'clock? You would scream bloody murder, how unfair that is. I haven't had a chance to review it and see it, and how can I respond? You know that your side would say that to us. And so that you're getting the same response on amendments that are filed today at this hearing. Don't be surprised when we take offense to it. I yield back.
Time of the gentleman has expired. For what purpose does the ranking member seek recognition? The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
I'd like to thank my colleague, Mr. Kildee, for offering this important amendment. Last month, the Trump administration sent a budget request to Congress that proposes to eliminate not only the Community Development Block Grant, but also the Home Investment Partnerships Program. The administration claims that these programs don't really show results and that states and local governments should pick up the tab. But we know that the federal government has an indispensable role to play here. And we know that many struggling communities are simply unable to compensate for such a dramatic reduction in federal investment. We've heard from local elected officials and community advocates from across the country, from urban and rural communities alike, who have attested to the critical importance of these programs for American families. We know that both CDBG and HOME are used successfully every year, year after year, to attract private capital and produce affordable housing in underserved communities. In fact, we know that for every dollar of CDBG funding invested, we leverage an additional 3.65 in other funding, and HOME has supported nearly 1.6 million jobs and created $100.7 billion in local income since its inception, while building over 1.2 million units of affordable housing since 1992. These are typically complex deals that involve financing from multiple sources, and oftentimes these deals would simply not be possible without CDBG or HOME funding. While Republicans have shown great interest in increasing private sector participation as well as increasing jobs, they continue to ignore the very programs that help us to do just that. They refuse to acknowledge that so many stakeholders, including private housing developers, continue to tell us which is that without programs like HOME and CDBG that are simply insufficient incentives for the private sector to engage in the affordable housing sector. Mr. Chairman and members, first of all, where did Mr. Duffy go? I wanted to thank him for recognizing I'm a good person. Yes, I am. I'm a good person who cares about the poor. I'm a good person who cares about homelessness. I'm a good person that cares about feeding children and giving people children a place to live that is safe and secure. I believe in the Bible that we should feed the hungry and we should clothe the poor and house the homeless. And so thank you for the compliment. Now, you know a lot about CDBG. You talked about what you know about CDBG. If you know that CDBG is a decent program, but it needs to be better targeted, Mr. Chairman, I'm speaking to Mr. Duffy. Would you please allow me the ability to do that? Sit here, Mr. Duffy, so I can talk to you. If you know so much about CDBG and you feel it's a good program, but it just needs to be targeted to those who are truly as you would consider eligible, why didn't you produce an amendment to keep CDBG and straighten it out? Why didn't you come up with the way that you think it should be spent? Why would you support zeroing it out instead of supporting making it a better program, making it do more what you want? Why didn't you come to me and ask me to work with you as you're saying I should come to you? You have the majority on your side. You have the chairman who runs this committee. You have the ability to get the votes, to get whatever you need out of this committee. I don't have that ability. So my question to you is this. For all that you care about, homelessness, CDBG funding, the Home Investment Partnership Program, the Choice Program, any of these programs that you think are good but just need fixing, why don't you offer an amendment to do that? Why don't you offer to work with us to do that? Why don't you bring forth your ideas about how we can improve these programs? Yes, again, I want to thank you for recognizing I'm a good human being. I care about the least of these. I care about poor people. I care about children. I care about veterans. And the proof of the pudding is in the eating. I put my money where my mouth is, and I simply say, this is what we can do to help those people that this good person cares about. With that,
Are you yielding to me?
yeah, I yield to you.
I still like you. I do think you're a good person. We disagree on a lot of politics, and though you wave your hands at me and throw them in the air, we actually work together on a lot of issues. And again, I think, you can throw your hands in the air, but you're not going to make me stop liking you, Ms. Waters. Still like you. Listen, I go back to this point.
Reclaiming my time. I don't want you to like me. I want you to support the people who need support from the Congress of the United States of America. I don't care whether you like me or not, really. What I care about are these people that we're sent here to represent. And so while you're doing all the liking and saying I'm a good person and all that,
the
show it
gentlelady's
in the way
time
that you
has
legislate.
expired.
I yield back the balance of my time.
Are there any other further debates on this amendment? Seeing none, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from California. Oh, Mr. Kildee, did you want? Oh, Mr. Kildee, I'm sorry. It's Mr. Kildee's amendment. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the nays appear to have it. Mr.
Chair.
And the amendment is not adopted.
Mr. Chair.
For what purpose is the gentleman from Michigan?
Recorded vote.
The gentleman requested a recorded vote. A recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote shall raise their hands and be counted. A sufficient number of hands being raised, the recorded vote is now ordered, and pursuant to subsection C5 of Rule 3 of the committee rules, further proceedings on this amendment are postponed. Is there any further amendments or discussion? For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk, which I'm not quite sure how it's enumerated. Kildee number 2.
We'll pause while the amendment is distributed. Kildee number 2.
Right, it follows number 1. Thank you.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Kildee on page 10, line 23, insert the following.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And at the risk of redundancy, let me suggest again that we stipulate to disagreeing on the question of process. This is an amendment that you're seeing for the first time right now. It's not a subject with which this committee is unfamiliar. We've had significant discussion, and while it may not have been the subject of a specific hearing, it's come up in hearings, and I think we have a fairly well-educated committee on the question. The other point that I would make, not to belabor it, is that we did receive the budget views and estimates last Thursday at the close of business. We were out of town on Friday and gone for the weekend. We came back yesterday to vote on 2 post offices, and we were able to meet with our staffs to put together our approach to this. So I would, perhaps the chairman would yield to answer a question, is how long ago did you receive the budget views and estimates?
I would say Thursday.
Okay, and how long has the committee been working on drafting the budget views and estimates?
I can tell you, I don't know the answer to that question.
And how many times did the majority consult with the minority on the content of the draft? I don't remember being consulted when issues that I'm clearly associated with were being drafted. I would have appreciated that. I mean, my point, and you don't have to answer the question, my point is that there are 2 sides to this coin when it comes to bipartisanship. And I agree that there are lots of things that we can work together on. I think this is one of them. But it's a little tiresome to have every amendment that we offer basically have most of the debate subjected to a critique of the fact that in the one half of a business day that we've been in the same town, that we didn't consult with one another on these amendments. I get it. Maybe the timing is something we need to address. Maybe a week or two in advance we could have this, and that might allow us, when we're in the same space, when we're in the same town, to have more conversations. Most of our conversations take place on the floor. The only floor time that we had since we received the budget views and estimates was, again, voting to name 2 post offices.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yeah.
I do think on that point, you were probably working on these amendments for the last week or two.
No.
You knew what you were going to do,
No, because we didn't see the budget views and estimates to determine whether or not this was included. The fact that the CDBG program, for example, is not even mentioned, we were not aware of that until 5:40 p.m. on Thursday.
But all day Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and we know how this works. Our teams will work together. They'll
Reclaiming my time.
propose.
We actually do know how it works, and most of the communication that takes place between members takes place when we are in proximity to one another, when we have conversation, as you and I occasionally do on the floor. Let me just not beat that horse. That, you know, there's an old saying: is when your mount is dead, dismount. So I think we'll leave this one alone, right? Let's get off this horse. This, I imagine we won't. The amendment that I have today is, again, another simple one, which deals with HUD's housing counseling program. We know that housing counseling works. We know that it has a significant impact on the performance of home ownership, and particularly the performance of mortgages. We've heard testimony that makes that point. What I am suggesting with this amendment and would ask consideration of is that we request $65 million up from FY17's level of $50 million, with the belief that that modest investment in federal resources clearly pays us back multifold in more successful home ownership by those folks receiving that counseling. It saves not only the federal government and the communities and states where the people receiving the housing counseling may live, but the private savings, the more successful home ownership experience, the more current mortgages, the reduced forfeiture and foreclosure of properties as a result of this really modest investment is one that I strongly suggest that we support. And again, without beating the horse on process, I would simply say that we have had a lot of discussion. This is simply a question as to the level of funding that we think the program ought to enjoy, and I don't believe that the current commitment is enough. This is a modest suggested increase, and I would ask my colleagues on the committee on both sides of the aisle to support this amendment. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Is there any further debate on the amendment? The chair moves to strike the last word and recognizes himself for 5 minutes. I would, again, note that this is an amendment that is a good example of why pre-filing and discussions could be helpful. The gentleman from Michigan is referencing reports of the Philadelphia Federal Reserve and the Urban Institute and Freddie Mac and CoreLogic, reports that I haven't seen, and to say that we should adopt those reports as part of the budget views and estimates of this committee, it's not going to happen. And by the way, again, I bring up the objection that the gentleman could have pre-filed it, and yes, you could have worked on amendments on Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and on the floor last night you could have said, oh, you know, Wisconsin and Michigan are going to sit and have a wonderful conversation about how we can have an amendment tomorrow, and this is what I'm thinking, and can you talk about it? Would you read it? We can move quickly, and we can talk to each other, and if you say, you know, 4 or 5 days wasn't enough, last night we could have been talking about it. This morning we could have been talking about it. As we've been having this debate, your amendments could have been sent over to go, this is a really important issue I want you to look at. But again, you keep springing amendments on us. And if you want to accomplish an end goal of having an amendment accepted, because we have bipartisanship, we exchange and share ideas beforehand. We all do that, and the gentleman from Michigan understands that. The gentlelady from California understands when we want to move legislation, we work together. And if you don't want to move legislation, we spring things on each other, and both sides can do this. We both can play this, play gotcha politics with each other, but we know that it's gotcha politics. It's not about legislating, it's not about accepting amendments, it's about playing a political game. And this morning, when you offer amendments that we haven't seen before, when you've had 5 days to offer them, is, I believe, is more about playing partisan political politics as opposed to saying, hey, I have a great idea. I really disagree with what's in the budget views and estimates. Let's make some modifications and changes to it. And I would just note that the gentlelady from New York took a serious approach. She wanted her amendments adopted. She said, let's work together. I'm going to show them to you in advance. She did it. The gentlelady from New York sent over her amendments, and we worked with her and agreed with her and accepted her amendments. That's the way you do it. And she was serious about what she wanted to accomplish because she has a serious problem in New York City about capital expenditures and mold. And she says, you know what? I don't care who controls this committee. I care about my people and getting my views accepted. She didn't say, I'm going to spring this on you the day of the markup. And had she done that, she wouldn't have had an amendment that was adopted. But she chose to try to legislate and work together and was successful. The gentleman from New York is not trying to do that. He's trying to say, I'm going to spring this on you and play, I would argue, more politics. But to come here and say, I have a pure heart, and I'm trying to really accomplish a noble end goal by not working with you beforehand, I think is disingenuous.
Would the gentleman yield on that point?
I would.
I listened carefully to the chair's admonishment of the characterization of members' intent and character. And I would suggest you take close attention to the words that you just used. You may disagree with whether or not I should have pre-filed this amendment. And that's legitimate. The rules of the committee allow me to pre-file this amendment. But I would hope the chair, when he takes the seat again, would remind you as well, as you objected to the ranking member's characterizations of your motivation to make commentary about what is in my heart, take commentary as to what is in my heart, or whether or not the fact that I didn't pre-file this amendment is constituting as your words, partisan political game, as opposed to
I'm going to reclaim my time, and I would note that I didn't object to the gentle lady from New York or from California's characterization of me. The chairman made commentary on that on his own. Again, she said some not so great things about me, but I know we like each other. We get along very well together. I know she didn't mean it, but again, I didn't mean to offend the gentleman from Michigan. What I was maybe I should reclassify. I should reclassify then what I said, and I apologize for that. My concern is it goes back to: do we want to work together and legislate? Do we want to have an impact on the budget views and estimates? That was my point, and I think that we do work together beforehand. And the gentleman from Michigan and I have done that before, and I think this could have been an example of that as well. That didn't happen, and they're being filed at the last moment, which makes me concerned that it's less about working together and having things accepted than it is about springing these issues on us at the last moment. And my point was specifically that the gentlelady from New York did it and did it well and had her amendments accepted. With that, my time has expired. For what purpose does the gentlelady from California seek recognition? She moves straight to the last word. She's recognized for 5 minutes.
I'd like to thank my colleague, Mr. Kildee, for offering this important amendment. There is substantial research demonstrating the benefits of housing counseling in terms of promoting homeownership as well as foreclosure avoidance. For example, one study found that first-time home buyers who receive counseling are up to 30% less likely to be faced with serious delinquencies than those with similar credit profiles who were not counseled prior to the home purchase. The same study showed that with a counselor's help, 69% of the study participants obtained a mortgage remedy, and 56% were able to become current on their mortgages. It would be irresponsible and short-sighted to reduce funding for housing counseling as the Trump administration's budget request proposes to do. Investing in housing counseling is a win-win-win scenario wherein borrowers are better equipped to become responsible homeowners and better able to avoid foreclosure. Government programs backing these mortgages have fewer losses related to foreclosure expenses, and the housing market overall is healthier. We would be investing more into housing counseling rather than reducing funding for these programs. As I said when I first started out to speak about this amendment, I said, and I think most members here know it, there is substantial research demonstrating the benefits of housing counseling in terms of promoting home ownership as well as foreclosure avoidance. I would challenge any member on the opposite side of the aisle on this issue, and I would challenge them on whether or not they have ever heard of or know about this research that demonstrates the benefits of housing counseling in terms of promoting home ownership. And I would ask Mr. Duffy and other members, how complicated is this? How difficult is this? You're talking about not having filed in such a way that you would have an opportunity to do research that's already been done to understand this very, very simple amendment with all of the substantial evidence to show the benefits of housing counseling? How complicated could this be? What does it take? We can file an amendment at any time in this committee, and we have done that. And I want to know what's so complicated about this very simplistic amendment that's offered by Mr. Kildee that you don't understand it, that you have not heard about the benefits of counseling and promoting home ownership and avoiding foreclosures, et cetera. And so I would simply say that the excuses that are being used today over and over again, these excuses are not credible. Excuses that simply say, oh, well, I didn't get a chance to review it. I didn't know anything about it. Yes, I care about it, but no, I didn't do anything. I didn't offer an amendment. And on this particular one, I will reiterate what is so complicated about supporting housing counseling to avoid foreclosures, to avoid mistakes, and to help home ownership. I don't buy the excuses that are being given about procedure, about I didn't hear about this amendment in time. Is there anything that you have heard about or that you know about that you can apply when you hear an amendment that is being offered that is logical, that makes good sense, and that has been proven to be helpful to the citizens of this country? I would submit to you this is a fine example of a very clear-cut, simple amendment that does not need hours of review and debate, that the substantial research that we all know about can be applied here, and this amendment should be supported. Anything less than support of this amendment is simply an unwillingness to be of help to people who are simply trying to benefit from home ownership and avoid the pitfalls of home ownership and learn how not only to understand their mortgages, but to understand all of the upkeep and everything else that goes along with home ownership so that you can know that it is affordable and you can carry it out. So with that, I would challenge the opposite side of the aisle on their knowledge or lack of about the clarity of this amendment. I would simply yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. Is there any further debate on the amendment?
Green from Texas.
The gentleman moves to strike the last word.
I do.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Not only to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman, but also to defend Kildee and support Waters. I thank God, quite frankly, that this attitude that's being displayed today did not infect the Supreme Court. Because if this attitude infected the Supreme Court, we would not have Dred Scott overturned. We would not have overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. We would not have Brown versus the Board of Education. We would not have Shelley versus Kramer, Burroughs versus Jackson. If this attitude had prevailed, we would still have a segregated society. We find reasons to find exceptions in Congress with a degree of regularity such that some might conclude that the exceptions are the rule. It is unfortunate that we are not basing our decisions on whether these are good ideas, as opposed to whether or not there is a simple rule that in some cases will cause harm in presenting ideas that may be embraced at a later time. So I stand with Mr. Kildee, and I support Ms. Waters, and I will yield back the balance of my time on this issue.
The gentleman yields back. Is there any further debate on the amendment? Hearing none, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Michigan. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the nays have it. The nays have it. The amendment is not adopted. Is there any further? The gentleman from Michigan?
Seek a recorded vote.
The gentleman seeks a recorded vote. A recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote shall signify by raising their hands and be counted. A sufficient number having raised their hands, a recorded vote is now ordered. Pursuant to subsection C5 of Rule 3 of the committee rules, further proceedings on the amendments are postponed. Is there any further amendment or discussion? The gentleman from Michigan. The gentleman has an amendment at the desk. We will pause while the amendment is distributed. Is this Kildee 1?
Kildee 3.
Kildee 3.
We're trying to do them in order. That part's orderly.
Kildee 3.
Thank you.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Kildee on page 8, line 30, after communities and
Without
quality
objection, the reading of the
affordable.
amendment is dispensed with. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized on his amendment for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Cities are unique landforms where people live and work. They're places that are creative, inventive, ingenious, and that ingenuity connects and creates incredible, really great big ideas. The history of the world is written such that we know that cities matter. But right now, there are only a few elements of federal support for America's cities and towns. The HOME program, CDBG, both are relatively modest investments in cities. And so my view, and many of you have heard me talk about this for a while, we need a far more robust agenda for America's cities and towns, and we need an explicit statement of the federal government through HUD on cities. I was in local government for a long time, 25 years in county government, watched my hometown of Flint go through a painful decline, and watched as both state government and the federal government, and to be fair, during periods of both Democratic and Republican administrations, continue to step slowly away from the obligation to have an agenda around cities and towns, and especially those communities that through externalities beyond their control, globalization, changes in technology, regionalization of economies, relocation of wealth and economic activity from core communities into their regions. Many of these communities have really struggled making that transition from the old to the new economy, and that struggle comes at a high price. It comes at a high price certainly to the people who live in those communities, who very often feel locked in those communities, but it comes at a high price to the country itself. All of these places, and especially this subset of American cities that have seen significant population loss, aging infrastructure, weaker economic conditions. All of these places have the capacity in one way or another to make contributions to the quality of our society, but now are simply very often stuck trying to manage decline. The Department of Housing and Urban Development was created in large part to deal with those challenges. And again, to be fair, what has taken place in the last decades, really, has been, I think, an abdication of an important part of the charge to that agency. It's the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And what this amendment seeks to do is to ask that department to craft an explicit and clear strategy so we can understand what their strategy is for these places. And to put it in short, to put the UD back in HUD. Much of the focus is rightfully on housing. Housing is an important part of our society, and it can't be understated how critical the housing needs in this country are. But that housing in cities takes place within a context. And far too often, we ignore the fact that the context of that market really matters, that these places are really struggling. And if the federal government is going to take its proper role, I think, in ensuring that the mission that we have charged these agencies with is actually being adhered to, we have to hold the agency accountable for having an explicit plan for cities and towns, particularly those cities that are right now teetering on the brink of insolvency. Sadly, it's not a small number. Many American communities are moving slowly toward that place where the basic elements of a civil society are being underfunded to the point that there are real serious consequences. This is a subject that we ought to spend more time on. It's certainly a subject that the Department of Housing and Urban Development should spend more time and resources addressing. And I think what I offer is an amendment that simply requires that the department provide us with a plan, an action plan to redevelop and reinstitute a focus on cities and towns. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? If no one seeks recognition, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Michigan. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. Nay, in the opinion of the chair, the nays have it. The amendment is not adopted. Is there further amendment or discussion? Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does it?
You're moving quick, Jeb. I took a sip of water and I almost lost it.
A recorded vote has been requested on a tardy basis, but nonetheless, all those in favor of a recorded vote shall raise their hand and be counted. A sufficient number having raised their hands, a recorded vote is so ordered, and pursuant to subsections C5, Rule 3 of the committee rules, further proceedings on the amendment are postponed. Is there further amendment or discussion?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
We'll pause and allow the amendment to be distributed.
May I have amendment number 3 first, please, Mr. Chairman?
Amendment number 3, green number 3, should be distributed. We'll pause and allow the distribution to take place.
Mr. Chairman, upon distribution, I ask that the amendment be considered as read.
We'll allow the amendment to be distributed. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment
Mr.
offered.
Chairman, I ask that
Without
the amendment
objection,
be
the reading of the
considered as
amendment is
read.
dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this amendment addresses the President's request for $39.2 billion for HUD as opposed to $48 billion. It's a cut of about $8.8 billion. And Mr. Chairman, I believe that this money is useful. It helps people who are in need of help. There's little dispute about this. But there seems to be the opinion that poor people can do more with less, and wealthy people need more to do more. I am not of this opinion. Mr. Chairman, it is quite ironic that this cut that the President is proposing comes less than 2 months after the President signed into law a $1.5 trillion tax cut, much of it going to the very wealthy, much of it going to major corporations. Mr. Chairman, it appears to many that the President seeks to pay for his $1.5 trillion tax bill on the backs of, and unfortunately at the expense of, poor people, persons who need help. I do believe that there are many people on this committee who have bemoaned the fact that the deficit is increasing exponentially, who don't agree with this. And by the way, the deficit is increasing exponentially. And it is because of money that is being spent. Money that is being spent that could benefit poor people will no longer be spent. So, Mr. Chairman, my amendment simply says that we should have the level restored to $48 billion, what it was in 2017, so as to allow us to continue to help the needy and not allow us to put the greedy ahead of the needy, not allow us to simply decide that poor people can do more with less, while the wealthy need more to do more. With that said, before I yield my time, I would gladly yield time to someone who would care to ask a question. Hearing none, I will yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any further debate on the amendment? For what purpose the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I want to briefly thank Mr. Green for offering this amendment and call attention to the fact that there are real consequences to a budget that would dramatically cut the commitment that HUD has to supporting communities and housing and those people who benefit from those very important programs. We're talking about hardworking families, seniors, veterans, persons with disabilities, all would feel the consequence of this drastic cut. Communities trying to right themselves and invest in community and economic development would feel the impact. The kind of deep cuts that we're talking about would include the complete elimination of new funding for the National Housing Trust Fund, Capital Magnet Fund, which are programs designed to increase the supply of affordable housing. It would eliminate the Community Development Financial Institutions Fund and the Community Development Block Grant and Home Partnership programs, as well as key rural housing and community development programs, all of which have been very successful in supporting not just communities, but business development in rural and urban areas across the country. To add insult to injury, these cuts would shamefully eliminate funding to repair and maintain public housing, eliminate repairs in public housing that's already stressed, essentially abandoning efforts to provide safe decent, affordable housing for millions of children, families, seniors, veterans all over the country. These aren't just figures. They're not just numbers on a piece of paper. These are programs that make a difference in the lives of people who benefit from them, and that difference would be taken from them. I support the efforts of Mr. Green to shine a light on these drastic and irresponsible cuts. I urge my colleagues to support his amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any further debate on the amendment? If not, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. Nay, in the opinion of the chair, the nays appear to have it. Is there any further discussion?
A recorded vote is requested.
A recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote shall raise their hand and be counted. A sufficient number having raised their hand, a recorded vote is so ordered, and pursuant to subsection C5 Rule 3 of the committee rules, further proceedings on the amendment are postponed. Is there further amendment or discussion?
Green number 4, Mr. Chairman.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Strike the last word.
The gentleman has an amendment at the
Present
desk,
an
aisle
amendment.
number 4. We will pause and allow the amendment to be distributed. Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr.
I ask that it be
Green.
considered as read, Mr.
Without
Chairman.
objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. Gentleman is recognized on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this amendment deals with the procurement process at HUD. And we recognize that HUD is cutting and streamlining to a certain extent. We just had an amendment that addressed the cuts at HUD, some $8.8 billion in cuts. And Mr. Kildee quite eloquently gave statistical information, he gave indications as to how these cuts will impact real people in real time, I might add. We know that these cuts will cause rents to increase, affordable homes may be impacted. They impact low-income people. But the cuts are being made. But at the same time the cuts are being made, there are other expenditures at HUD that are taking place. It's been reported that Mr. Carson is purchasing a dining set at some $30,000 plus, I might add, $30,000 plus, $8.8 billion cut, $30,000 plus dining set. Seems that we would want HUD to be efficient, but we'd also want that efficiency to embrace the procurement process that would allow a $30,000 plus dining set to be purchased. It seems that it would be appropriate to indicate that the committee understands that using funding efficiently does not only include the programs at HUD, but also the use of appropriate tax funds for procurement of interior decor for HUD's headquarters. That doesn't seem unreasonable. As a matter of fact, it seems like the kind of thing that the majority would, on its own motion, include in these documents that we are currently considering.
Would the gentleman yield?
Of course I will yield to my friend from Texas. I always have and I always will.
I appreciate the gentleman for yielding. I also appreciate the fact that the gentleman shared with the majority his amendments last evening. And I am impressed by the gentleman's amendment. I am prepared to recommend that it be accepted. I would be even more impressed with the gentleman's amendment if it included the CFPB's tree boss crystal staircases and contemplative areas of rest and relaxation, but I approve of the gentleman's amendment, and yes, HUD must be very careful with their procurement of interior decor, and I thank the gentleman for bringing his amendment to the majority's attention, and again, I recommend its acceptance. I yield back to my friend from Texas.
I greatly appreciate my friend's commentary and am amenable to working with you on any aspects of spending that is inappropriate, and would look forward to continuing our conversations. But also, having been a trial lawyer, I know when to exit the courtroom. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any further, for what purpose does the gentleman from Massachusetts seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Well, we're still proceeding on the gentleman's amendment from Texas.
Okay, I'm sorry, you're right.
Is there any further debate on the amendment from the gentleman from Texas? Seeing none, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. Is there further? The ayes have it. The amendment is adopted.
Green from Texas has an amendment at the desk.
In which this is styled as number?
This will be number 5.
Number 5. We will pause and allow green number 5 to be distributed. The clerk will report the amendment.
Ask that it be considered as read.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. This deals with disaster recovery. And quite frankly, having lived in Houston now for many years and having seen Harvey, the Tax Day flood, the Memorial Day flood, and having seen the means by which we recover from these horrible disasters that we have suffered, I have concluded that we have disasters after the disaster, that the funding that we so desperately need, and quite frankly, sometimes we do acquire it, but it does not move as quickly through the process as I would like to see it move, and a good many people who are suffering, who are in harm's way, would like to see it move through the process. And this amendment has little, if anything at all, to do with how we vote on emergency supplemental bills, very little to do with it. In fact, I would say nothing to do with how we vote. But it does have to do with HUD's responsibility to quickly and efficiently disperse funding. I'm willing to work with HUD to see if there is some means by which we can move this money to people who need it quickly. And I'm not just talking about Houston, Texas. The wildfires that we've suffered, and I say we because I'm an American. I love my country. When the people in California suffer, I suffer.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes, sir.
If the gentleman is prepared to take yes for an answer, the chairman is prepared to recommend acceptance of his amendment and would use the opportunity to again remind all members that the gentleman from Texas chose to share his amendments with the majority last evening. And although I'm not prepared to recommend acceptance of all of his amendments, this will be the second amendment that I will recommend that we accept because he chose to file on a timely basis and work with the majority. And again, I thank him for his thoughtful amendment. And as a fellow Texan who has visited with many victims in Houston, yes, HUD has a responsibility to do exactly what the gentleman said, move quickly and efficiently, and so I would urge that we move quickly and efficiently with his amendment. I yield back to the gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, again, having heard the ruling of the court, I exit the courtroom.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further debate on the amendment from the gentleman from Texas? If not, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All the opposed shall signify by saying nay. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman from Massachusetts seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment to the desk.
We will pause, and I'm sorry, this is
Lynch number 1.
Lynch number 1. We will pause and allow Lynch number 1 to be distributed. Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Lynch.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment would ensure that our committee acknowledges that weak regulations that were in place before Dodd-Frank contributed to the 2008 crisis, costing taxpayers and our economy trillions of dollars. Efforts to undermine critical safeguards like the enhanced prudential standards, including capital liquidity requirements, leverage ratios, stress testing, living wills, etc., and the Volcker Rule and Orderly Liquidation Authority, and efforts to undermine FSOC and OFR will only lead to massive budget deficits as a result of more financial crises. Dodd-Frank has, in fact, strengthened consumer, investor, and taxpayer protections while promoting economic growth and financial stability. Since 2010, much in contrary with the majority's views and estimates, more than 18 million jobs have been created with Dodd-Frank in place. Over 95 straight months, the longest stretch on record, and because banks are healthier, having added more than $750 billion in capital. Bank lending to businesses is also up more than 75% since Dodd-Frank became law, which disproves claims that responsible regulations have hampered bank profits. Wall Street has also seen significant gains, with bank profits increasing by over 5% in the third quarter from a year earlier. And community banks also saw profits rise up 9.4% from the third quarter 1 year earlier. As such, I just ask that this amendment be included to the views and estimates to indicate the true progress of the economy since Dodd-Frank was adopted. With that, Mr. Chairman, I will yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair yields to himself to say since the imposition of Dodd-Frank, the big banks have become bigger, the small banks and credit unions have become fewer. The gentleman has important views. I urge him to ensure they are placed in the minority views and estimates documents that I'm sure the Budget Committee will give all due consideration to. I urge a no vote. I yield back the balance of my time. Who seeks recognition? Is there any further debate on the amendment? If not, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. Nay. In the opinion of the chair, the nays have it, and the amendment is not adopted. The committee will now stand in recess subject to...
Recorded vote.
Recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of recorded vote shall raise their hand and be counted. A sufficient number having raised their hands, a recorded vote is so ordered and pursuant to subsection C5 of Rule 3 of the committee rules. Further proceedings on the amendment are postponed. The committee will now recess subject to the call of the chair. The chair anticipates that we will reconvene immediately following floor consideration of H.R. 4607, which will be approximately 1:45 p.m. The committee stands in recess.
Thank you.
can't let you bat 1,000 now. And he can't bat 1,000, but you're going to have a good batting average today with the chairman, a very good batting average. Thank you. I'll see you on the floor.
Whose is this?